Y'all know what it is.
Hey everybody, this week on Eggs, we have special guest Chris Leonard. Chris has been in the live audio business for nearly 20 years. Early in his career, he toured as a monitor engineer with the Maryland Sound International, and such artists as Tears for Fears, Don Henley, Disturbed, Josh Groban, and Anthony Hamilton. Presently, Chris is the director of audio at IMS Technology Services, a full-scale production company which provides audio, video, and lighting solutions for special events, conferences, and conventions nationwide. Chris and his team have provided technical support for some of the largest events around, including Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl Victory Parade in 2018, which saw more than 800,000 people in attendance, and the last 4 presidential inaugurations. Joining us to talk about getting his start in the audio business, what it's like to run the largest stages in the world, what the future holds for the live entertainment industry, and so much more, please welcome to the show, Chris Leonard. How are you, Chris?
Hey, man. How's it going?
Doing very well. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Really appreciate your time. Can you give us kind of a brief overview how you got into it? I saw some pictures with you and your dad back in the day doing some mixing on your website, and he looks like it was kind of fun to grow up working with him. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, the joke I typically have is that I've been gigging since I could walk, or doing sound since I could walk, and it's not far from the truth. My dad did the whole like bar band, cover band scene when he was in college. And then when I came around, he was doing stuff like in our local church, and some local bands and stuff. So every weekend I was putting gear in the back of a station wagon, going to coffee houses, VFW halls, bike rallies, and doing shows. And so, yeah, so it's been kind of in my blood and part of me ever since I was a kid.
Yeah. So that's a pretty early start. When did you get like your first solid gig? Like what was your weekly?
Yeah, I mean, technically through high school, I was working through my buddy's band. It's funny. It's like a second generation thing. So the keyboard player in the band that my dad worked with, his son was same age as me. We're like a few months apart. And so we grew up together. And then once, he came around to high school, he started doing the band thing. I started doing sound for him. We're going around doing gigs, through the different iterations of bands he had. I helped him record some of his albums. So, I mean, I was technically getting paid as early as high school to do this. And there was a local production company that my dad and I helped out as well in town. We would do, some low level, Christian market scenes that would come around town, some like the colleges and universities or churches and stuff, some small festivals. So it's I don't know, a year, I don't know, middle school, high school, was probably first paying gig.
That's pretty awesome. Did you have any like bar gigs or anything before you went from, working with your dad to doing in-ear monitors for, artists like Josh Groban?
Yeah. So, I mean, the high school stuff was your typical, my buddy's band was small stuff, and then I went to school for sound. High school didn't go so well for me. And so, I technically a dropout of high school. I was going to be probably 21 if I continued to stay in high school before I graduated. And so, I got out of school and I was like, what am I going to do with my life? I want to do this sound thing, but I wasn't really aware of what the industry held. Like, my dad always dreamed about like, go on the road and doing this thing, but I didn't really pay attention to what that was. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I got to go to school for this. And so I went to recording school, just like a year program, at night school type of thing. But that led me to get my first gig at Maryland Sound.
Okay.
So Maryland Sound is, one of the largest. Actually, at one point they were the largest company in the country, or probably even world. And then they've kind of diminished off their rock and roll. That was back in like the 80s that they were kind of the heyday. But certainly one of the bigger companies in the area. They're still around. They've been around since late 60s. So, I spent my first couple months there just what we call sweep land, which is basically you're sweeping the speakers, making sure they all work. You're cleaning cable, you're humping gear, that type of thing. And slowly progressed my way up into doing. So it wasn't like out of high school, all of a sudden I'm out mixing for Tears for Fears and Josh Groban.
So you've always been in the live arena. You never did any studio recording or anything other than that little bit you did in high school with your friends.
Yeah, the studio thing never really intrigued me. Listen to the same song 100 times for the chorus, punching in like this just didn't, I went to recording school because I wanted kind of the fundamentals. I mean, EQ is still EQ, compression still compression, so a lot of those things still translate. But and they had a live portion to the class, so it was definitely it was my way to get towards doing live sound full time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And it's so funny when you think about, I mean, just how far you've come too, from the guy that was humping gear to this. We've talked to a couple other high profile sound engineers on this show before. And that seems to be the story, right? Is I guess, doing your time, sort of serving, for the sound company and just humping that gear and soldering wires and doing all that kind of good stuff before you actually get to touch anything.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting story. So can you talk about sort of maybe your first big gig, like, maybe a moment that you came to that was sort of a high pressure moment where this is the put up or shut up kind of moment?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I had done a couple of tours, just as we'd call like the stage jammer, or the guy who patches things on stage. So I had gone on a couple of those, and it was fall time or whatever, and we were setting up for a tour that was about to go out, and I was delivering the gear to a small like symphony hall, and it was for this guy Savian Glover. He's a tap dancer, and the monitor engineer was just going to be a system guy from MSI at the time. And when I show up, the guy was like, "Oh, are you a monitor engineer?" And I was, I had a quick split-second decision to make there of like, how do I answer this? And now I had never done monitors on tour, but I had been doing monitors some with MSI, and I was like, yes. Like, all right, cool. Well, help me set this up, help me dial this in or whatever. And I dialed it in and get things together. And he's like, well, do you just want to do the tour? And I'm like, sure, yes. He was like, just got to check with Bob, but Bob being the owner of MSI. So I called up Bob, and Bob's like, well, don't F it up. So it was a little bit of fake it till you make it, but not too much. I mean, it's good old analog console, Midas XL3, which is like an old school monitor desk. And it was not an easy gig. I mean, so we said tap dancer, but he had, we carried this deck that was like 8 foot by, I don't know, like 24, that we put Barksberry pickups all the way around the deck for him to tap on. And then it was called Classical Savion. So we had like a small orchestra behind him that was all open air mics. And then we had a jazz band that would play with him. And so all these open air mics, he had 7 wedges all around him. He wanted his taps blaring. So that mixed with the live orchestra and stuff, it was honestly one of the hardest monitor gigs I've ever had, but I was able to survive. And it afforded me the opportunity to, say, hey, I can do monitors on tour now, and was able to progress from there.
That's pretty neat. Chris and Pooch, who we've had on this show before, they're front of house engineers. And there's a big difference between a front of house and a monitor engineer. Our listeners don't really, we're kind of a creativity podcast. We don't really focus on audio. We kind of just go over careers and in the industry type thing. I don't think they know the difference between what you would do for a monitor mix versus a front of house mix. Can you break that down for them? And then also talk about the difficulties of doing monitors over front of house, because there's different things you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so monitors would be, front of house would be the guy who's out front mixing for the audience. That's what, most of the audience hears is what the guy's mixing or girl. Monitors is typically a person who's side stage, typically stage left, but it could be stage right, which is, again, I guess the audience may or not know that. But anyway, if you're standing on stage, if you're standing on stage facing the audience, stage left is to your left, and then stage right would be to your right. But the artists all have to hear, and that can mean various things for different people. And for some, it's these floor speakers that are on the stage so they can hear, and maybe one per person on stage, sometimes multiple per people, or these things called in-ear monitors, or IEMs, which are what they sound like, instead of big cans, or literally, you've probably seen them if you've watched any Grammys or any other show, these molds that are in their ears, and somebody has to mix for all those. So typically the front of house engineer is only doing one mix, maybe an auxiliary thing, but for the most part, he's doing one mix. A monitor guy or girl, I mean, we're doing sometimes 6, 8, 10, 24, 30 some mixes all at the same time. When you're going festival style, you have 10 different people yelling at you all at the same time for what they want, and you gotta wrangle that. It's
Well, and it's not just like it's not like you're hitting one knob per person. Each person wants okay, I want more of the bass. I want more of this. I want more of that. And each person has their own specific kind of mix that you have to do for them. And so it's kind of like, you're taming 30 different beasts while the front of house guy is taming one. And it just completely different scenario versus a normal mix down that most audio engineers would have to do.
Yeah, it's a different thing. There's a lot of people who there's a whole joke of friends don't let friends mix monitors, right? There's this whole where, I mean, look, it's it is a tough end of the snake to handle. You're dealing directly with these artists and these personalities, whereas a front of house, who cares if the drunk guy's yelling at you to hear the guitar solo more? You maybe got to please a girlfriend or a tour manager, but that's pretty easy. On stage, that artist doesn't like you, you're not coming back the next night, or potentially mid gig. There's a lot of psychology that goes into doing monitors, and that's actually one of the things I really liked. Was I liked getting into people's headspace and knowing what it is that they want. I just told this the other day. When I was out with Tears for Fears, Roland, the main singer, he would come out each day to sound check. He'd come up to his microphone and he would sing Kathy's song by Paul Simon. I Hear the Drizzle of the Rain, right? And it was a moment where I'd listen to him, watch his body language, and I could tell when he sang those few lines where he was at that day. And so it's that getting in that mindset of knowing, anticipating what somebody wants without them asking.
So with the current technology and being able to do digital playbacks, can you get pretty close with the digital playback for monitors and then kind of make fine tunes once the artist is there, or does it work differently? I'm not a touring guy. I've never really done monitor mixes. My background's as a DJ. I went to school for recording arts so I could learn how to manipulate audio. And now I'm really getting focused into live sound because it seems like it'd be just a really fun thing to do, get out of the DJ world and just kind of work with bands. Can you use virtual playback to work with your monitors and get them close, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely you can. I mean, the time when I was out there, mind you, for those who don't know, I haven't toured in 10 years. I've been doing the corporate audio thing. We can get to that. But so right when I left was kind of the cusp of when we call it virtual playback, was kind of coming into the scene. And for those who don't know, basically you can multi-track record every input that's on stage. And when the band's not back there, you can play it back. So you can basically, it's a way we can actually practice without the band being there. So yeah, you can absolutely do it with monitors. There's certain things that are difficult, right? So I mean, we don't just hear right where our ears are. We feel things. It's different depending on where you're standing on the stage at the time. Someone's all the way on stage right, yet there's this massive guitar stack on stage left. That's going to be a completely different experience than the person who's standing all the way on stage left, right in front of the guitar stack. So some of those things in virtual playback aren't going to fully translate. But most tours these days, people are on in-ears, and the stage volume is as minimal as possible. And so when you have no real amps are on stage, the only really acoustic sound on stage is just the drums themselves. When you have a scenario like that, virtual sound check is basically the exact same thing. Nice. Minus the physical PA, the speakers in the room. That's the other big difference is, the speakers in the room are going to make a difference too. So, but if a front of house guy can play along at the same time, then yeah, it's about as close as you're going to get without the band being there.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. Well, and I think that people just don't, when you go see your favorite band perform or whatever, I don't think you appreciate just all these things that go on. So I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about that kind of behind the scenes stuff. Do you mind then? Let's talk a little bit about that transition out of, doing live music or these types of performances to, this more commercial route. What brought that about and what was the opportunity that you pursued to move into that space?
Yeah, so like many people who are touring, met my wife while on the road. Eventually had a baby, and the road life is not easy. It became a tough decision of wanting to be home more for my family. And so for those who don't know, when you're touring, the average decent tours, you're looking at 3, 4, 5 months sometimes at a time before you're home. Some of the tours I did, the longest I was out was probably 3, 4 months. There's other people who go out longer than that. I mean, some of these artists, when they go out on tour, I mean, they're doing a year and a half, 2 year tours. Now there's going to be some breaks in there, but I mean, you're gone a lot. And that can be tough on the family life. So it was a tough choice to make, leaving behind what I had started to create. I wasn't in the touring industry too long, and by some people's, tenure. I mean, I was only there for about 7 years. That's not that long, relatively. But I was able to accomplish a lot in a short amount of time. And it wasn't a career move. It was a life move, is what I kind of tell people. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going this way. And, because of career, I've now been able to make a career for myself within the corporate world, but that wasn't the goal as a career move.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's important to point out too, because I think there are a lot of people, I mean, sure, there are guys who can be sort of lifelong sound guys, but you're right that this, life on the road is challenging. It's a difficult life. I mean, we glamorize it in the sort of the media, or, when you hear people talking about it, it sounds sort of glamorous, but maybe it is for the guy that's, taking the, private jet from place to place. But for everybody else that's, straggling along and loading gear and sound checking and doing all this stuff, I mean, it's pretty tough work. And not to mention, as you said, when you sort of have a family back home or whatever, it can be a real challenge. So I think that's great. But I think, with the commercial work, it seems that there's a little more tenure for these guys. So, you had the opportunity to get out on the road, but now you really can build a career around the stuff that you like doing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of people, there's kind of, you can be a freelancer in the corporate audio space, or there's video and lighting as well. Or you can be, a lot of people are full timers at some major companies. So there's 401k, there's health benefits, there's, job security, there's all those things that come along with from the corporate world that are nice to have for some people, and still working on some of the same gear. There's still some people who work in the corporate world who are still doing, you do these large general sessions where, Don Henley's coming to play at your general session. You could still be doing corporate work and working at these A-level touring artists at times, or other times, it's 10 doctors on a panel talking about, ketosis and how that affects epilepsy. You know what I mean? So like, yeah. It's, I'm not going to lie, a lot of the corporate stuff isn't very glamorous in terms of, but I mean, we do some large shows that can be kind of fun, and you do like award shows where you get to do a lot of flash and trash with lights and loud music and stuff. So it's, it's just a different way of doing audio, but I mean, there's still, all the physics are still there, all the same gear.
So I used to work with a company in Phoenix that we did a lot of corporate events similar to that. And we did high dollar proms where we'd come in and we'd set up a full nightclub in a school gymnasium, and 30 by 30 foot roof with moving heads. And I was the lighting guy at the time. And so I have a lot of history.
I'm sorry. I'm just kidding.
Right. So I wish I would have known more about audio back in the day, because had I had that passion then, I would be a lot further along. But anyways, what I was getting at is some of the events that we did one that was at the federal courthouse. We had to get background for all of our employees to come in and bring stage and lighting in. And you've had the opportunity to work doing the inaugurations. I can only imagine what kind of security you have to go through and what kind of a setup and tear down an inauguration is. Can you maybe break that down for us, what it's like to go and set up and do that event?
Sure, yeah, and I just want to clarify one thing from the intro, where my bio is kind of written. IMS doesn't do the inauguration. That's Maryland Sound. I used to be able to say the last 4. I missed out on this one. I was supposed to be there right
Chris
before
was there.
Christmas.
Chris was there. Rabbled? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because of Gaga. Yeah. But I was supposed to be there. I got cut right before Christmas. because of COVID restrictions, obviously they cut the audience size down, and so they cut out a bunch of speakers. And so up until Christmas, I thought I was going to be there. But besides that, it's an insane event. To me, there's not a bigger stage, if you will, of an event with the prestige that it has, in my opinion, in this country. Right. So to be able to have been a part of 4 of them is awesome. Just, being a system tech. Security wise, you typically do your background checks and fingerprints a couple months ahead of time. And then it's a second round of fingerprints and photos and stuff once you're on site for the day of. So it's like you get a construction badge for like the building. Like we start loading in, the whole platform that they build the inauguration on, that starts about 3 months before the inauguration even begins, because that whole facade obviously is not normally there. Audio comes in about January 2nd and works every day all the way up until January 20th is the day of the inauguration.
Wow.
Multiple rehearsals. There's just thousands of, cables to run, hundreds of speakers to place. And, no matter the weather, you're out there every day, all day, that whole time. So, so day of show, there's a different badge you got to get through. There's a different badge if you're on the inside, which is what I was doing last time, doing comm. I got to put microphone on Chief Justice John Roberts and Clarence Thomas, things like that. So it's a really fun, unique event for sure.
Well, I can't even imagine just as regarding the setup, because not only are you providing a feed for, TV, you're doing, I'm sure the delay on that pavilion area is huge. So just trying to get everything dialed in has to be a complete nightmare.
Yeah, we spend, I wouldn't say nightmare. I mean, it's all very strategic, there are hundreds of speakers, both up on so not even the forward-facing ones that face out towards the audience, just the speakers that are facing all of the people in those grandstands. I mean, there's a couple hundred people up there. There's a distributed speaker system under the main platform. There's 125 little speakers under, one every other 3 seats on that main platform.
Wow.
And then in rings around as the balconies go up there are speakers in the railings. So you have to kind of time align and tune all of those. It's just very systematic. It's like anything in audio, you do one thing, right? You do one channel, you do one input, you do one speaker, and then you just keep going down the line, just keep doing that, however many times it takes to do that. And then the delay is you do your first speaker, and then you go on to the next, you go on to the next. And so, it can seem daunting, I guess, but I mean, it's the same process that you would do in a little ballroom. You're just doing it 100 more times or over longer distances.
Yeah. The Super Bowl event with 800,000 people has to be kind of similar but different at the same time. When the Seahawks won the Super Bowl, I was DJing kind of down in the area where they had the big event, and a million people around. It's got to be crazy to try and set up and plan for an event like that as well. Did you have one main stage and then go down run down the street as well, or what was the Super Bowl like?
Yeah, the Super Bowl Super Bowl victory parade was incredible. So we are the company I'm at now, IMS. We're the Eagles. We're their provider. So in their stadiums, like typically like their concourse levels and their club levels. There we go. That's what I was looking for. They have corporate events all year round, right? So we do events for them all year round. We do like their autism walks and things like that. So when it came time for them, when they were a week out from the Super Bowl, we got the call that says, hey, if we win, we have to be ready for a parade. And they knew that I had done work with like the inauguration and things like that. So I had done events of this scale, because being this was Eagles' first Super Bowl, they expected it to just go insane. And so we had 1 week to plan what would normally take months to plan. It was just one stage. If you're familiar with the Rocky Steps, there was a stage right on the Rocky Steps. And if you stand on the Rocky Steps and look out towards Philadelphia, it's about a clear mile shot to what's called City Hall. So we go down for the site visit, and I'm like, all right, so where do you expect people to be so I can know where to put speakers and point them? And they're like, everywhere. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, all right. So like I started making like these heat maps of like where I would think people would be and start designing the system. the system was over a mile long. So I had delay speakers basically after I got the first oval area. About every 400 feet was this giant pole with 2 hangs of speakers, shooting out across the different areas. But the last delay tower of speakers was over a mile away. That was a lot of delay time, right? So you have to what's called time align these speakers so that when you that way it's not like a pop 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 when someone speaks. It all kind of moves at the same time, so we had to prepare for a whole week whether they were going to win or not. So we had to be ready Monday morning to go to start loading in if they won, because the parade's going to be on that Wednesday.
Wow.
And so I never cared more about a football game in my life than watching that. I'm actually a Ravens fan. I'm from Maryland, but since I've been in the Philly area now for the last 10 years, I was like, okay, I can root for the Eagles on this one. And so I designed a system. I was able to mix it. If you are a football fan, the Jason Kelce speech was a pretty epic, speech. I was heavily riding the gain knobs on that because he was just eating that microphone. It was an intense event. I mean, the people. Yeah, 800 some million. It's hard to tell how many people were there, but I mean, it was massive, and there's definitely nothing like it.
Well, so how does that work when you do have that much delay or that much ground to cover? Is it basically, I guess, opposite of delay? So the guy is speaking in real time and it's being transmitted, this full mile away, but it's got to hit the back people at the same time he says the thing. So is there sort of a reverse delay where he's speaking and they're actually hearing it in the back first or something? How does that work?
No, I mean, the idea is, so if you didn't put delay, it would be instantaneous. Like as soon as he said it up front, you would also hear it a mile away. But then you would hear it again because air doesn't stop moving, right? So the speakers from the front are still pushing air down. So you would hear it multiple times. And so if you didn't delay all the speakers to the front, and so what it is like, so if he spoke out of the first speaker, the time it takes the airwaves to move from that first speaker to the next speaker, you have to put that amount of delay time in so that basically the next speaker is picking up where the airwaves will meet it at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So technically the people in the back, yes, are hearing it later than the people in the front. However, if you didn't actually delay the speakers, you would hear multiple repeats of the same word.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's what I was trying to figure out is, if he's speaking, is he saying something, but because of the delay so that the people in the back are hearing it at the same time, like if it was, I don't know, sort of going in reverse order or something. So, but your explanation is perfect. I get it now. Yeah.
It's crazy to just all the moving parts in any type of system like that. Just the time.
And that's the thing is, I've been a part of, festivals and stuff like Mike, you and I went and saw Kings of Leon up at the Gorge in Washington. And it's the same sort of thing, right? They've got a delay. They've got a crowd of 120,000 people or whatever it is. So they've got the different tiers or the different rings around the stage. So I understand it in principle, but a mile long, that's pretty bonkers.
It's a lot of delay. So to speak even further, we had to stack delay. Typically the units that you would use to do these delays aren't, I had over 3 seconds of delay by the time it was at the end.
That's insane.
And they're just not even made for that, right?
That's a lot. When
normally you're dealing milliseconds.
Milliseconds. Yeah. If I'm in a theater or in an arena, we're talking, I never hit a second, let alone 3 seconds. So what we did is there was a certain point where the first speaker for the main road started, we delayed the signal for that standpoint and then restarted the signal from there, starting on that already delayed time. So you're putting delay on top of a delay and then doing delay in the amplifiers as you went down the way to kind of stack the delay, because typically over 3 seconds, you don't normally delay that much.
That's right. So crazy.
But the person speaking is hearing themselves in real time via monitor or something, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel weird, because I guess if you were speaking over that delay, it'd be really hard to keep with it.
Yeah, and sure, there's reflections, right? There's major buildings everywhere. You're going to hear it, but for the most part, you're hearing a direct sound right next to you.
Very cool.
So that's an amazing gig. That's pretty crazy. I always wonder what it'd be like to set up a system like that and have that kind of just craziness going on. Most of my stuff is pretty small, so in comparison, I've done
But
pretty good sized
well,
stuff. But
maybe this is just another technical question, but I mean, like, are you physically running cable a mile away? Like, I mean, are you running a hard line that way, or do you start dealing with wireless stuff, or is there another way of moving audio from A to B?
Yeah, sure. So where we can, we would hardwire. We would use fiber basically to run to kind of each tower, because you can run fiber, thousands of feet. It's not a problem. As far as there was a certain point down what's called Broad Street. Actually, it's the Parkway, where we used RF, radio frequencies. We were kind of transmitting it like a radio station, if you will, and had antennas at each tower. So you had like a local generator powering a local amplifier for that speaker cluster, and also was like an LED wall there, so people could also see what was happening. So that was like a big transmission that was shooting down. So a good bit of the delays were picked up what we call RF or radio frequencies to go down the way, because you could have done it over fiber, but the problem is you got to run that cable. You either got to string it up or you got to run on the ground, hope it doesn't get cut, things like that. So, yeah.
Well, and that I think was the thing. I mean, in my head, I was envisioning the world's largest snake running from the soundboard at the front, something that runs a mile down the road. I was just like, I couldn't figure it out. I was having trouble wrapping my head around it.
But if you want to think about different context, so Times Square New Year's Eve, which I've also done, they take up that whole section. That's all hardwired. They don't do any RF in there in terms of the speaker transmission. So, they start on December 26th and they're every night, and they're running fiber from like light pole to get to each tower. So, it could be done. It's just a matter of time and resources.
Okay. Well, and then I guess, speaking of resources, you didn't have a lot of time to plan this thing. I guess was it Maryland Sound that did this one, or was it the
IMS?
Company?
So this was IMS.
Does IMS have all this gear just laying around in stores? Obviously you're going to have to set aside some gear so you're ready. Like, how does the technical aspect of just gathering equipment work for something like this that may or may not happen?
Yeah, so it's a pretty common thing in the industry to subrent or partner with another company, right? So, while we're not technically set up at IMS to do events like this, I could partner with MSI. And so, like, the other thing that MSI had were these things, we call them the poles. You see them at the inauguration, you see them at Times Square New Year's Eve. They're these 40-foot poles that you can hang speakers from, as opposed to having to build a big scaff tower. So, MSI brought in 14 of those for me. You can only fit 4 of those a flatbed per truck. So, there was, I had over 250 what they called, JBL Vertec
I like the Vertex
boxes.
Yeah.
And these are big boxes, right? So like the boxes are dual 15s for the low end, 4 8-inch drivers for the mid driver. It's a big effing box, right? And I had almost 300 of those, flying in the air for this gig. So
I can't even imagine.
It's all about having resources, I'm still good friends with the guys at MSI, and we trade gigs back and forth as we can. So that's just part of the industry.
So
that's awesome.
Your current role at IMS, you oversee everything. You oversee the hiring, the planning, like if you're going to go out and do a big gig like this, you oversee all of that. Can you talk about going from, just being responsible for monitor land to being responsible for a bunch of employees, a bunch of moving parts, making sure you have the right configuration for this and that? It's got to be 2 separate worlds, yet applying the same principles that you learned in monitor land into it.
Yeah, so it's definitely a different world. When I came to IMS, we were a much smaller production company. And so when I came in, the director of audio position was more of like a department head, right? I wasn't managing people. I would just happen to be the guy who knew the most about sound at the time. And so I would help either design systems, I'd help train, I'd help our production managers design shows. And as the company grew, the director role grew with it, right? There's more employees. And so, the director of operations couldn't manage all of the employees, and it kind of became more siloed because we did audio, video, lighting. So we'd have a director of audio, video, and lighting. And so that I was able to grow into management, if you will. And it was a lot of learning along the way, taking courses, either reading leadership books or podcasts or things like that. And, but the touring side gives you some of those skill sets of, on some of the road crews. I mean, you're managing 15, 20 plus people at a time, loading out a show at fast paces. So there are some of those management skills that kind of come into place from the touring world that I could bring into this. So it's been it's been a journey that I kind of learned through over time.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, maybe, I don't know, this might be kind of a hard draw to just pull it out of your mind, but I wonder if you could point to any specific, like, sort of leadership practices that you did pull from working on the road. Because I think there's actually a pretty cool metaphor there that hadn't occurred to me before, but it's this idea that, how structured and rigid that production is, right? I mean, you've got to get in, out, everything has to be where it has to be. Like, I mean, it's a precision machine. And so, but I wonder, you mentioned having just kind of learned some characteristics while you were doing that. I wondered if you had some, I don't know, some fables or something you could share from your experience in leadership on the road, and how that prepared you for your post now.
Sure. There's a couple things. And a lot of these things, it's you don't realize them until hindsight, or until you start to talk about things like this in terms of what was setting you up for this stuff. Like, for instance, when I was just working at Maryland Sound, in between tours, I would work as a local stagehand at the local arena. Sure, to pick up a few bucks, but really what I was trying to do is I was trying to learn from some of the other tours that were coming through. I was trying to see what it was like to be on the other side, right? Like, now, instead of me directing the stagehands, now I'm a stagehand. I'm taking direction from another person on tour. So I would try to, like, psychoanalyze, okay, well, how did they get me to get this task done? How did they communicate this? What worked well, what didn't work well? And then when I go back out on tour, I can, maybe, not be as much of an asshole, or, this guy said, okay, hey, if you're done your task, you all come over here and you stand here at this corner of the stage until I come and get you, right? And so, little things like that. So and then from a monitor world, that psychology thing. So one of the things that I've learned through the years is I like to study people. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't know that was early on, but I know now, it's empathy. It's a word that I didn't know about until a few years ago, yet it was something I was learning and engaging in early on without knowing what the word was. And to me, management is all about empathy. Some people who are consider that a weakness. Maybe like some type A personalities consider empathy a weakness. I consider it the most valuable tool in terms of managing people, because if you can't relate with them and understand where they're coming from, you're never going to be able to be on the same wavelength with them. So coming up from being a tech through the years, now into some sort of management, I know where people are coming from. So I'm relatable in that sense. So I think it's one of those paths that you didn't necessarily see coming, but you look back now and you can kind of see the building blocks through the years of how it got there.
Yeah. And I mean, like, this plays into stereotypes a little bit, but I mean, a lot of those road crews, I mean, people come from pretty diverse set of backgrounds, and there's a lot of tough life stories and great life stories and all kinds of things in those crowds. I mean, I spend a lot of time touring and managing bands. And, you meet a lot of these guys that are running the stage and everything, and they come from all points and all backgrounds, and not all of them are pretty. So to be able to empathize with those people, not only just from the day-to-day work stuff, but also the life stuff, be able to manage people that come from different backgrounds and things like that, I think is really critical. So I think that's a great point with empathy. Yeah.
I also like how you brought up the, pulling from different people that you're working with, like trying to get their knowledge out of them so you can learn from that. I was listening to your episode with Ken Newman, and he was talking about his casino gig, having people coming through, and one particular sound guy would come through and make his sound system sound 100% better, whereas he thought he had it close, but this one guy knew about phase aligning or this or that, and he didn't know that yet, but he was able to pull that knowledge out of that person and apply it into his repertoire or his little tools. So I like that.
And I think that's a great metaphor just for, business leadership in general. Being able to sort of lean on the people you work with to fill in those gaps, and being open to learning new ideas, because there are plenty of people who just don't give a rip. So So while we were sort of talking stereotypes, so you're now into podcasting. You're well into podcasting, which, for me is kind of an interesting thing, just in that most sound guys aren't looking to be in front of the mic. And so I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about just sort of the transition into podcasting, what fueled it, why you started doing it, and where you're at today.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely didn't see the podcasting thing coming. That's for sure. It actually started because about 6 years ago, I got into this one podcast. It was early on, by a band that I liked, and I take it back. Actually, I didn't know the band at the time. So the band was Emery, and the podcast
nice.
is Bad Christian is the name of the podcast, which they're on over 500 episodes at this point. And I was early on, into them, and they had like this like fun beatbox thing at the front of their episodes early on. And so like I started like I would take all of their intros, and I made like here's the first 10 intros, and I put it like in the BC Club was like their Facebook group, and I put it in there, and they loved it. And so like the guys reached out to me like, hey, we want to do more stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And so I started making promo clips for them, just because I was friends with them or fans of them, I should say. And they were like, hey, we're going to make a 100th episode. We have this spreadsheet of all of these clips. Can you download them, cut them up, and put it together and make the 100th episode? I was like, yeah, sure. So I made their 100th episode. And this was all just like free because I just enjoyed doing it. Then there were some guys who were in the BC Club who wanted to start their own podcast. And so I started working with them and just background stuff. I wasn't on the mic, just I was doing editing for them, graphic design. We built a website. We had 12 bloggers putting out 2 blogs a week. So I was doing like the graphic work for that. Like it just all like, just fun, different creative outlets to kind of get my hands into. And then, I'm listening to this Signal to Noise podcast, happens to be an audio podcast. And I reached out to the guy, and I was, Michael Lawrence, who was the host. And I was like, hey, I like this. Maybe you should try doing X, Y, and Z. And we got to talking a little bit more. And he's like, hey, do you just want to be on the podcast? And I'm like, yeah, sure. I love talking audio. And so this was in November of 19. And here we are, beginning of 21, we're all coming up on our 100th episode, almost 150,000 downloads at this point. It's a lot of fun, to just sit here. We always say we would be having these conversations with the people we're having the conversation with, regardless whether people are going to listen to it or not. So the fact that people can be entertained or learn something on top of that is just added bonus.
So I listened to one of the Signal to Noise episodes with Kyle Churnside, and he was the front of house engineer for Voy. And just going through that episode, he brought up a band that I haven't heard of in forever, and it's Norma Jean. No one probably knows who that is, but when I was working down in Phoenix, a bass player for a band that I worked with called Black Box Burning was huge fans of Norma Jean, and I haven't heard that since it's probably 15 years ago, and it's just really cool to hear those kind of stories and hear how the church shows and the fights in the parking lot and all the crazy stuff that you never really hear about unless you're there and you're a part of. And that's one thing that Signal to Noise podcast and How We Got Loud, you break down some stories of some really early tech and how things started and the people that the pioneers in the industry. I really enjoy your How We Got Loud series because it's very fascinating to me about hearing how a guy had to create an insert to be able to pan his channel left and right. It's like stuff like that. Struggle is real back in the day. So.
Yeah. Maybe that would be a good place to talk a little bit about your new project, How We Got Loud. You're the guy who likes podcasting so much you did it twice, and so yeah, let's talk about your new thing.
Yeah, How We Got Loud. So I started with the concept about a year ago. On Signal to Noise, we talk to people who are front of house engineers, monitor engineers, broadcast, theater. It's all over the board. And some of the people we talk to are, like legends in the industry. And it's like, oh man, it would be kind of cool to kind of do a series on, some history of live sound stuff. And it just didn't thought about this, it didn't really fit the model of what we were doing, or didn't have the capacity to do it in what we were doing. And I was like, I'll maybe start my own thing. And I came up with the logo. Michael of Singleton Noise came up with the name, How We Got Loud, but I came up with the logo and the concept, and I just sat on it. I designed the logo January last year. I didn't launch my first episode until November of last year. Obviously COVID and stuff happened, and was very busy with changes at work, but I started to think about it more. It's like, hey, this should be more than this is not just a podcast. Like, there's more to this. When it comes to the history of live sound, there's a lot of information out there, but it's like in nooks and crannies on the web, or in books, or in people's heads. There's a lot of people's stories that aren't captured. Two people know about two people typically. They know about this guy Bill Henley, who did Woodstock, right? They call him like the godfather of festival sound. Which he wasn't the first, but I mean he was early on and helped kind of pioneer this industry. And then people think of the Grateful Dead with a wall of sound, right? But those, in my opinion, are two minor stories compared to the broad scope of, we're talking 50, 60 years worth of history. And so I was like, I'm going to make this bigger than just a podcast. So the podcast is really a means by which I'm interviewing people, and people are going along with my journey of learning the history of live sound. And I hope that manifests into something larger. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm working on a whole back-end database system where I'm cataloging every console that was ever made, every speaker that was ever made, the year it was released, every sound company, who the owner was, who it was sold to. I'm cataloging all that stuff as I learn this stuff, and I plan on getting this content together at some point. But it's to capture all this, it's going to take a lifetime. So I've literally been saying I'm dedicating the rest of my life to making the ultimate history of live sound. So it's going to take that long. I mean, that guy Bill Henley I mentioned, who did Woodstock. There's a guy who spent the last 10 years just on Bill Henley. He just released a book called Last Seat in the House. Wow! And he spent 10 years on one guy. So like I could zero in on some of these guys and spend the rest of my life on them. I'm going to try to go a little more broad stroke on the industry. And then when I can kind of narrow in on certain areas, we're in a relatively young industry. Some of these guys are, they're in their 70s or 80s, but they're still around. Whereas like the guys who made the car, or the guys who did other things, they're just not around anymore. So time is of the essence to kind of get their story and their perspective on the industry. And so I'm feverishly, along with everything else I got going on, trying to work on that.
Well, that's great. I think anytime that a project has that kind of mission behind it, it's a great thing. And yeah, I mean, God, I'm like, what's going through my head right now as we're talking is, documentaries and books and directories and guides and all these things, and I think it's pretty important. I think live audio is one of these things that just we sort of take for granted because it's kind of all around us, whether it's something going on in the park or it's a concert we've been to or whatever. And you go to see 21 Pilots and you're blown away by the stage and all this stuff, but like, you just kind of don't realize like what goes into all that, right? It just is sort of a given that it exists. And so there's sort of this subculture that I think is really important to explore. And it's awesome that you're doing it.
Well, and if you think about it too, audio really, I mean, it's like you said, it's in its infancy. It probably the 40s and 50s is probably the earliest PA setup kind of out there. And then from there, technology just kind of came along. You hear about like the early tape delays or the plate reverbs or using an actual room for a delay, and just the stuff that they used to have to do to record the Beatles. I mean, like just the tech is so fascinating and interesting. You can go down some dark rabbit holes trying to
and I honestly think it's one of the coolest things about live audio, especially. And I don't think a lot of people think about it this way, but if you think about it, almost like an art form in that, from those early days, I mean, basically it's an industry that's been pushed as if you're, pushing snow, like you're basically solving problems as you run into them, and now we have some pretty slick software and we have some pretty slick, technology and stuff like that. But I mean, you got there through, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of pushing snow uphill and solving each problem as you hit it. And so I think it's important that you are interviewing or thinking about the legacy of some of these, more famous sound guys and the things that they did that made them innovative, because I think that really that's maybe the word for the industry is innovation, right? I mean, it's always innovating.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember, like, when the industry started, like you said, 50s, 60s, the gear didn't exist for this stuff. So a lot of the original tech they were literally taking stuff out of theater, right? There's these Altec voice of the theater speakers. They're the speakers that are normally behind the movie screens, and they're doing the rock and roll with them. And obviously they were okay for a little bit, but like, the mixers that we use, consoles, you couldn't go to the store and buy this stuff. So companies for decades literally were making their own consoles, making their own speakers, all of that stuff. It wasn't stuff you could buy on the shelf. It wasn't the industry that it is now. And that, to me, like you said, that innovation, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to study with this is like the whole, like, chicken, egg, cart, horse type of thing of like what came first, right? So part of this has to do with how the history of music progressed. Like a common example would be like, just think of like the modern day EDM, right? That music was developed before there was a way to actually translate it live, right? And so like all these massive subwoofers and these massive setups, they came along because of that music, or, rock and roll, if you will, was getting louder through the years, or aggressive, if you will, which translated into louder, wasn't louder to begin with, right? So they had to develop the means of, well, how do we get this louder? Or how many speakers do we really have to add to get to the back? More. And
how do we not blow out these speakers every show?
Right.
How do we build something that's durable enough to handle this kind of beating? And yeah, it's just incredible.
Well, one thing that I like that you do on your LinkedIn is you share the old photos of the rigs. And I mean, I love just scrolling through there and seeing this picture from 1960 of, the first flown speaker, or, weird stuff like that. I just think I love what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. Yeah, if you follow on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, How We Got Loud, I'm trying to, like, either pictures that I come across or stuff that people send to me. Yeah, pictures worth 1,000 words, right? I mean, there's so much you can learn from what that looks like.
Well, and I think too, what I really like about your approach is I think for so many people, young people especially, but for so many people, we're always looking for what's next or what's the next thing. And I don't think we're paying enough attention to those that came before us and learning all the lessons that were there. And so I think it's really important, in such a high tech, technological field where you can, bounce a signal a mile away and hear it in more or less real time, to go back and think about those guys and how did they actually hang that speaker, and why did they decide that hanging the speaker was the way to go, and why, just say, whatever it is, but there's certainly a million stories, but I think it's so interesting that regardless of how technologically advanced you are, that you're going back and you're looking at the ways that it was done, and you're trying to glean whatever you can glean from those people. And so I think that that's an interesting way of looking at life that I'm not sure everybody is doing.
I think the other thing, aside from innovation, actually the word that sticks out most to me is passion.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so, when I describe why it is I do what I do is because I have had and have a passion for doing sound. I want nothing to do but sound for the rest of my life in some capacity. And most of these people, that's exactly it. I mean, they didn't drag themselves through these years with these bands and night after night going on tour and innovating all these things because they were chasing money. Right. They were chasing their passion. And so resonating with that passion with these people, I mean, that's what I really try to pull out of people. It's like, well, what drove you to do this? And whether you were a failing musician or you got drug into it or whatever, at a certain point, the staying power was passion. It certainly wasn't money. I mean, yes, you can make a decent living in this industry, but if you're here to make money, you're solely, you're doing the wrong thing. There's a joke that kind of goes around actually by this old sound company. It's like, well, how do you make $1 million with a sound company? You start out with 3, right? Because the investment it takes.
I was going to say, sell your inventory.
the investment it takes into these speakers, like when these guys would go on tour, the next biggest act to come around. I've been talking to some of the guys at JBL, and these people are dumping $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 worth of speakers at the start of a tour. And they're not going to make that on that tour, right? It takes multiple tours and stuff to make that money back. The economic side of it is another thing I'm exploring because, yeah, if you looked at it on paper, it's like, this doesn't add up, you know?
Yeah, I've been
Yeah,
down
well,
that
and
road.
I can only imagine. Yeah.
Uh, um,
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I can only imagine when you look, especially at what stage productions are today. I mean, I used the example earlier of 21 Pilots. We went and saw them 2 years ago, I guess now, with our boys. And I mean, their stage, I mean, they have crap hanging from the ceiling. They have multiple 2-3 stages. They have, lifts and cars on fire and all this stuff. It's like, I mean, I couldn't even imagine what it costs just to run that show for one day, let alone a whole tour, let alone buying any gear, let alone, I mean, it's pretty incredible. I can't imagine.
Well, let me give you an example. The console that most tours are working with start typically in the $100,000 range just for the console.
Yeah, it's
so
well, and that's crazy, right? I mean, I guess you do have to be a 21 Pilots to make any money on these things, because it's going to cost you $1 million a day to do your show, and you've got to make $5 million a day in ticket sales.
Well, the 21 Pilots isn't buying the speakers to take on the road.
Right.
No, of course. But even if they're just renting that gear, it's still incredibly expensive, I'm sure.
Well, and I kind of went down the road of trying to do the corporate gigs and everything on my own. I bought 15 sticks of Tomcat truss with corner blocks and base plates, and started buying a bunch of moving heads and trying to get into this world. And right when I got to the point where I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be great, COVID hit. And so all of my gear, I bought all this truss, all this lighting stuff, and it's just been sitting in storage for the last year and a half. So it's kind of, I'm itching to put it to use and actually make some money with it. But can you talk to us a little bit about how COVID maybe affected IMS and their industry and how they kind of pivoted and shifted to accommodate for that?
Yeah, for sure. It's been interesting. Fortunately, being in the corporate world, first off, I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, there are thousands of people who are still to this day without a job.
Yep.
Right. If you were anywhere remotely involved in entertainment, hospitality, whatever, I mean, you haven't worked in over a year now, or a year, and it's devastating. So when things first shut down, no one knew what was going to happen. Everybody was like, oh yeah, I think by fall live events will come back, or blah blah blah. But in the meantime, we had to generate revenue, and so the buzzwords of pivot was we had to do virtual meetings. What we do now is virtual meetings, which we were doing things like it before. In other words, like we were at a conference, you would standard webcasting would be you have the general session and you're broadcasting it to a player page so that people at home can kind of watch, right? And that's pretty basic. But when you're talking about taking an actual conference and bringing all of those, we call them callers in, right? So like we're on a Zoom call right now, bringing each of these video sources all into our video switcher, basically like a broadcast studio. We're creating TV, but for the corporate world. We do these things called PIPs, like picture in picture. That's where you put the different boxes across the screen. You're doing these lower thirds, like the name across the bottom, animation, video rolls, things like that. Everything you can to basically make a broadcast TV show, but for a corporate setting, whether it's a sales conference, whether it's a town hall meeting. So we definitely had to, and a lot of these processes are things that we hadn't done before. So you're learning as you're going. You're trying to figure out how much you can actually charge for these things. Building these studios, and a lot of it is companies would build the studios out of what gear they actually had on hand. No one's going to have any money to go out and buy maybe the right gear for the job. You're using the video switchers you had, which may not be set up right for the right type of signals to do these types of things. So we were fortunate and able to kind of scale up. We have 4 what we call full-on studios, where it's like to speak specifically like a Barco E2 or Barco S3, where you can do multiple layers of switching and stuff. And a typical show, if you will, has maybe 4 or 5 people running it: audio person, a video person, a webcaster, all those things. But we definitely we had to go through layoffs, significant layoffs, significant furloughs. Fortunately, we were able to bring a bunch of techs back. I've lost almost my whole team around me in terms of, I'm the director of audio. We had a director of lighting, video, 2 labor coordinators. They're all gone. So for the last year, I've been doing the job of all 4 of them and myself. So I've been doing the job of 5 people for the last year to kind of make ends meet at the company. I lost techs that worked under me. It's been a struggle. I mean, we been able to kind of survive. That's the name of the word, right? Name of the game is survival, and we're surviving. If we're at this point of hopeful that by third quarter, what we call hybrid events would come back. So like maybe some in-person people, but a lot of the audience still at home. You still have those remote callers coming in. So we're still trying to navigate right now, like what that looks like from a technology standpoint. So it's a big migration and shift for sure.
That's crazy.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But I mean, I'm glad to hear that you guys are surviving. But yeah, it's unfortunate that that's all we're doing. And so, and I was going to ask you, sort of what you think the future holds. I mean, so you guys are thinking sort of Q3 maybe is what you're hoping for in terms, or are you hearing any rumblings of anything sooner?
I mean, let's be honest. We thought Q3 last year, hybrid meetings were going to come back, right? Yeah. So since mid last year, I look at things at a day at a time, right? I mean, yes, you have to plan for the future, but it's like, I'm going to take what's in front of me today and I'm going to tackle what's in front of me today. Who knows? Obviously the vaccine rollout, all these things are all big rabbit trails of who knows how well they're going to go, the COVID variants. So I don't like to talk in terms of predicting because we were wrong a year ago. We're going to be wrong again. So it's just, again, survive when we can, be ready for when it comes back. For a lot of people in this industry, I think the hardest thing is going to be being at your game that you were a year ago. Yeah. Whenever things come back, right? People in our industry has been amazing in that we've spent all this time, all this downtime. The amount of resources that have come out from a training standpoint in the last year is insane. However, I'm telling you right now, any videos you watch 6, 8 months, I don't care, 3 months ago, you don't remember that stuff. So all this content's out there. You're going to have to prepare yourself. I asked a tour manager the other day. I'm like, so what kind of grace or leniency or is there going to be for somebody who's rusty or maybe makes a little mistake? And he's like, none. You had this time. You get your shit together and you be ready. That's a scary thought, I mean, yeah. That's what I'm curious about is like when we do come back. First off, who's still left around, right? A lot of people had to trans and get go get jobs at like Home Depot or like other places. They might not come back to this industry. And so, or the people around, I don't know, or the new blood that wants to come into the industry, maybe they might not choose to because of how volatile it was. I mean, no one thought this industry could disappear like this. So it's tough.
Yeah, it's really hard
fair enough. Well, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's really hard for someone who's been in that position where you had work and you had solid work and then all of a sudden it disappears overnight and you have to reinvent yourself just to get by. It's hard to go back to that and say, hey, this is going to be my full-time gig again, because who knows 10 years from now if it happens all over again. So I relate to that because I've been out of work for a year and a half. I haven't put a needle on vinyl in 5 months, and it's going to just that first gig when I come back is going to be real sketch because it's going to be like, all right, let's see how this goes.
Well, like we were talking about earlier, though, I think that if any industry can do it, it'll be this one. Obviously it might be pushing snow again, but there will be, new innovation, new advances, new technologies, things like that to chase whatever the next iteration of live sound sounds like. So I have the utmost faith in everybody, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
For sure.
So as we're winding down here, I wonder if you could just sort of break down where people might track you down or check out the work you're doing, the podcasts, all that good stuff.
Sure. So, I mean, you can find specifically me on LinkedIn, Chris Leonard, right? Just search Chris Leonard. You'll probably be able to find me. And then my other two projects, so How We Got Loud, howwegotloud.com, or on any of the socials, just at How We Got Loud. And for Signal to Noise podcast, you can just go to signaltonoisepodcast.com, or both of those. You can just, if you're a podcast listener, search in your podcast player and, Stitcher, Apple, Spotify, you'll find all of them. So if you find one of those, you'll find me on all the other places.
That's perfect. So cool. Well, thank you so much. And just a quick note to everybody who tuned in today. We're really looking to build up our community in 2021. We're looking for a lot of interaction. So please feel free to email the show, contact the show through the website. It's eggscast.com. Like Chris mentioned, for his podcast and ours, feel free to check out all the podcast apps where every place good pods are found. So I guess with that, Chris, any parting shots? Mike, anything?
Nope. Think we're good.
No, I appreciate your time.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Chris. We really appreciate you doing this. It's been great.